Hollywood loves legends, but it has also crowned performers whose talent never matched their fame. For every celebrated star, there are actors who rose through hype, timing, or sheer luck, only to leave audiences wondering how they ever became leading faces at all. Behind glamorous marketing campaigns and studio protection lay careers built on shaky performances, poorly reviewed films, and roles that exposed every weakness they tried to hide. And yet, many of these actors kept being cast, kept earning headlines, and kept shaping the industry despite the criticism that surrounded them. But how did these performers climb so high while delivering so little? What was happening behind the scenes that allowed them to survive wave after wave of backlash? And why do their legacies still spark debate today? This is Fallen Icons, and these are the worst movie actors in Hollywood history. 15. Hayden Christensen. Hayden Christensen's rise in Hollywood was nothing short of meteoric. Practically unknown before his breakout, he was thrust into the global spotlight when he was chosen to play one of the most iconic roles in cinematic history, the young Anakin Skywalker. His face appeared on posters, merchandise, interviews, and red carpets almost overnight. At the height of the Star Wars prequel era, he became a household name, representing the tragic fall of a character embedded deeply in American pop culture. The pressure was immense, and expectations from lifelong fans were nearly impossible to satisfy. Hollywood positioned him as the next major leading man, and for a brief moment, he had the full force of the industry behind him. Behind the scenes, though, Christensen faced a challenge that would follow him for years, an acting style that many viewers found stiff and emotionally distant. Directors noted his quiet, introverted approach, which some believed clashed with the operatic, emotionally volatile arcs his roles required. Even with guidance and massive production support, his performances often felt constrained, as if he struggled to let the character fully take over. Interviews from the period suggest he was aware of the scrutiny, describing the extreme pressure of stepping into a world where every gesture, line, and moment would be examined by millions. The critical reaction to his work in the Star Wars prequels was swift and harsh. Reviewers cited awkward line delivery, limited range, and an inability to match the emotional intensity surrounding him. Fans debated endlessly whether the writing or the acting was to blame, but Christensen's reputation took the hit. Hollywood casting directors grew cautious, and major roles became increasingly rare. Though he continued acting, the momentum he once had evaporated, leaving him associated more with criticism than capability. Over time, public opinion softened. Younger generations embraced the prequels with nostalgia, and Christensen's return to the franchise decades later sparked renewed appreciation. Still, his legacy in American pop culture remains defined by a rare blend of massive fame and widespread criticism. His career illustrates how brutally the spotlight can expose a performer's limitations and how even the biggest franchises cannot shield an actor from becoming a symbol of Hollywood's most debated performances. 14. Taylor Lautner. Taylor Lautner's rise was a cultural phenomenon. Practically overnight, he went from a little-known child actor to one of the most recognized faces in American entertainment thanks to the Twilight franchise. As Jacob Black, he became a global heartthrob, a magazine cover favorite, and a centerpiece of one of the biggest pop culture waves of the 2000s era. At his peak, Lautner had an enormous fan base, studio support, and the kind of visibility most young performers only dream about. Hollywood positioned him as the next major action star, expecting him to carry blockbuster franchises and appeal to a wide American audience, far beyond the vampire craze. Behind the scenes, however, industry insiders noticed an early problem. Lautner struggled to transition from teen idol to credible actor. His performances in Twilight drew intense scrutiny. While audiences loved the character, critics repeatedly noted limited emotional range, overly rigid delivery, and a reliance on physical presence rather than nuanced acting. Directors who worked with him described him as hardworking and disciplined, especially with physical transformation and stunt training. but many felt he lacked the instinctive depth needed for layered, dramatic roles. When the franchise ended, this gap became starkly visible. Hollywood moved quickly to test Lautner's potential. Big studios handed him leading roles like the action thriller Abduction and supporting parts in ensemble films, hoping his popularity alone could carry the projects. Instead, reviews were scathing. Critics highlighted wooden performances, strained emotional moments, and difficulty commanding the screen without the support of a massive franchise behind him. The audience response was equally telling. Box office numbers dropped, and enthusiasm faded as it became clear that Lautner had trouble connecting outside the Twilight world. As the industry cooled, casting opportunities diminished rapidly. For a few years, Lautner attempted reinvention through television roles and smaller films, but the larger Hollywood machine had already shifted focus to new rising stars. Interviews from this period reveal a performer aware of his reputation, often acknowledging the intense pressure and the expectation to deliver performances he wasn't yet equipped for. Despite his dedication, the critical perception never fully changed. In American pop culture, Lautner's legacy has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of skyrocketing fame without the craft to sustain it. He remains a nostalgic figure for a generation that grew up with the Twilight phenomenon, but his career also represents how Hollywood can elevate someone at extraordinary speed and then abruptly expose every weakness once the spotlight moves on. His story continues to spark discussion about fame, typecasting, and the unforgiving nature of the industry. 13. Megan Fox. Megan Fox's ascent in Hollywood was explosive. Practically unknown before her breakout, she became an international sensation after appearing in Transformers. The film turned her into a pop culture icon. Overnight magazines, talk shows, commercials, and studio campaigns pushed her as the next major Hollywood superstar. Audiences were captivated by her screen presence, and she became one of the most recognizable faces of the late 2000s. At her peak, Fox represented a new era of blockbuster glamour, combining confidence, style, and a rebellious edge that studios believed would carry multiple franchises. Yet behind the hype, directors and producers noticed a recurring issue. Fox struggled to translate her striking presence into layered performances. Her early roles leaned heavily on visual appeal rather than character development, and once she was placed in more emotionally demanding scenes, critics began pointing out limited range and inconsistent delivery. Industry insiders described her as sharp, witty, and outspoken, but also noted tensions on set, especially when she pushed back against decisions she felt were unfair or creatively restricting. Those conflicts soon spilled into the public. Her fallout with Transformers director Michael Bay became one of the most widely discussed behind-the-scenes clashes of the era. Interviews and comments from both sides sparked a media storm, and Fox was ultimately removed from the franchise. While the situation drew sympathy from fans who admired her candor, it also fueled a narrative within Hollywood that she was difficult to work with, a label that can rapidly derail careers. Combined with skepticism about her acting ability, the industry grew hesitant to cast her in major roles. Films intended to prove her versatility, such as Jennifer's Body, Jonah Hex, and later dramatic attempts, were met with mixed or negative reviews. Critics often highlighted the same issues: flat-line delivery, struggles with emotional complexity, and difficulty carrying dramatic weight. Even when she was genuinely committed to a role, the shadow of earlier criticisms followed her. Casting directors began favoring newer actresses, and opportunities dwindled. Over time, American audiences developed a more nuanced view of Fox. Many now see her as a performer caught in the crossfire of early fame, intense objectification, and industry backlash. In recent years, she has rebuilt her image with more self-aware, genre-friendly roles, and interviews show a more reflective, controlled public persona. Still, her legacy in pop culture remains tied to the contrast between enormous early visibility and a career that never matched its initial promise. Her story highlights how easily Hollywood can elevate someone, and how quickly the system exposes flaws once the spotlight becomes unforgiving. 12. Shaquille O'Neal. Shaquille O'Neal dominated American sports culture like few athletes ever have. As one of the most iconic figures in basketball history, he carried an aura of charisma, humor, and star power that made him a natural crossover candidate for Hollywood. At his peak, advertisers, studios, and media executives viewed him as a larger-than-life personality who could anchor family films, comedies, and action roles. His fame alone guaranteed attention, and during the 90s and early 2000s, Shaq was everywhere: commercials, music videos, late-night shows, and movie posters. Hollywood believed his magnetic persona could translate seamlessly onto the big screen. But behind the enthusiasm, there was a growing awareness in the industry. Shaq's presence didn't compensate for his limitations as an actor. His first leading role in Kazam became infamous almost immediately. The film was widely criticized for its awkward tone, weak writing, and most notably, Shaq's stiff performance. While charming in interviews and effortless in real-life banter, he struggled to deliver emotional nuance on camera. Directors noted that his natural confidence sometimes clashed with the discipline acting requires, making scenes feel flat, forced, or unintentionally comedic. The gap between his real personality and his on-screen characters was difficult to bridge. His next major attempt, the superhero film Steel, only reinforced the issue. Despite the movie's ambition, Shaq's line delivery and limited dramatic range drew harsh reviews. Industry insiders later admitted that he had been cast for his fame, not his acting ability, and that the projects were built around marketing rather than performance. Even Shaq himself has joked in interviews about how badly some of the films were received, showing a self-awareness that softened public perception but did little to change his cinematic reputation. Hollywood's reaction was swift. After multiple poorly reviewed roles, major studios stopped considering him for leading parts. He continued to make cameos, particularly in comedies where his playful personality worked better. But the idea of Shaq as a serious movie star faded. Casting directors realized that while he was a beloved figure in American culture, he wasn't suited for traditional narrative roles requiring emotional depth or character complexity. In the broader landscape of American pop culture, Shaq remains a legend, but not for acting. His legacy in film has become almost mythic, a symbol of the 90s era when celebrities were thrown into blockbuster roles based solely on fame. Today, he is admired for embracing the criticism with humor and humility, but his movie career stands as one of the clearest examples of how star power alone cannot overcome the demands of serious acting. His story underscores Hollywood's long history of trying to force crossover success and how quickly the camera can expose the limits of even the most charismatic personality. 11. Paris Hilton. Paris Hilton became one of the most recognizable figures of the early 2000s, a symbol of a new era of celebrity culture driven by reality television, tabloid fascination, and branding rather than traditional entertainment craft. As the heiress to a global hotel empire, she entered the spotlight long before Hollywood tried to turn her into an actress. But once the simple life catapulted her into mainstream pop culture, studios saw an opportunity. If she could captivate audiences on television, perhaps she could pull off the same effect on the big screen. At her peak, Hilton was a cultural force. Paparazzi followed her everywhere. Magazines featured her on countless covers, and she became a defining figure of the famous for being famous generation. But behind the glamour, Hollywood quickly learned that her screen persona didn't translate into acting credibility. Hilton's early roles, including appearances in comedies and horror films, revealed limited range and difficulty delivering natural emotional beats. Directors noted that she leaned heavily on a stylized, exaggerated version of herself, the same persona that made her a reality TV sensation, but struggled when a role required subtlety, vulnerability, or character depth. Critics pointed out stiff line delivery, lack of immersion into the material, and an over-reliance on physical presence rather than performance technique. Her most discussed role came in House of Wax, a horror remake that became known less for its story and more for Hilton's casting. While her participation generated massive publicity, reviewers were blunt about her acting, describing it as flat and disconnected from the emotional tension of the scenes. Even Hilton later admitted that the film leaned heavily on her notoriety, using her image as a marketing hook rather than expecting serious performance. Attempts to pivot into more dramatic parts or indie projects didn't fare better, as industry expectations and public perception had already solidified. Hollywood's reaction reflected a broader skepticism toward celebrity as actor casting. After several poorly received performances, studios distanced themselves from the idea of Hilton as a bankable movie star. Opportunities dwindled, and she shifted her energy toward business ventures, DJing, and brand-building fields, where her talent and persona had far more impact. While she continued to make occasional appearances on screen, the industry had already moved on to new personalities better suited for acting demands. In American pop culture, Hilton's film career stands as an emblem of a very specific era, a time when fame itself could launch someone into movies, regardless of craft. Her legacy is complex. She is now recognized as a savvy businesswoman and a pioneer of influencer culture, but her reputation as an actress remains tied to performances that never matched the scale of her celebrity. Her story highlights how Hollywood often confuses visibility with ability, and how quickly the camera exposes the limits of someone unprepared for the demands of serious acting. 10. Nicolas Cage. Nicolas Cage occupies one of the strangest positions in American film history. An actor with undeniable talent, an Academy Award, and moments of brilliance, yet also a performer whose career spiraled into some of the most chaotic, critically panned roles Hollywood has ever produced. At his peak in the 90s and early 2000s, Cage was a genuine box office force. Films like Leaving Las Vegas, Face, Off, and The Rock made him a household name. His intensity, unpredictability, and commitment to eccentric choices set him apart from other leading men. Audiences admired his fearlessness, and Hollywood trusted him with major franchises and blockbuster budgets. But behind the scenes, a different narrative grew. Cage's distinctive acting style, often described as operatic, exaggerated, or intentionally erratic, became a double-edged sword. While it worked beautifully in certain roles, it collapsed in others, resulting in performances that felt ungrounded, overly theatrical, or unintentionally comedic. Directors noted that Cage approached acting through a unique internal method he called nouveau shamanic, embracing extreme emotional swings and unconventional character choices. When paired with the right filmmaker, it created magic. When paired with the wrong one, it produced some of the most bewildering on-screen moments in modern cinema. Financial troubles pushed Cage into an extraordinarily high output of films during the 2000s and 2010s, and that shift drastically affected his public perception. He accepted nearly every role offered: thrillers, low-budget action movies, supernatural stories, comedies, many of which were rushed, poorly written, or shot on minimal budgets. Critics noted that his performances became inconsistent, oscillating between quietly brilliant and wildly over-the-top within the same project. Audiences grew confused. Was Cage intentionally leaning into absurdity, or was he simply miscast again and again? Hollywood's reaction was complicated. Some studios hesitated to cast him in prestige roles because they feared his unpredictability. Others embraced him as a cult icon whose career defied traditional patterns. Reviewers produced entire essays and documentaries examining his acting quirks, and Cage became a pop culture paradox, admired and mocked at the same time. Even as his reputation wavered, he remained impossible to ignore. In American pop culture, Cage's legacy is a study in extremes. He is both celebrated and criticized, a symbol of how an actor can deliver award-winning brilliance in one decade and baffling performances in the next. His name appears frequently in discussions about the worst actors, not because he lacks talent, but because inconsistency turned him into a cultural phenomenon. Cage continues to reinvent himself with passion projects and indie films, reminding audiences that beneath the chaos lies genuine ability. Yet his roller coaster career stands as one of Hollywood's clearest examples of how fame, financial pressure, and creative risk-taking can collide sometimes spectacularly. 9. Tommy Wiseau. Tommy Wiseau became an unexpected legend in Hollywood not for mastery, but for delivering one of the most famously misguided performances in American film. Practically unknown before The Room, he stormed into the industry with a mysterious background, unconventional charisma, and an unwavering belief that he could write, direct, produce, and star in a major dramatic feature. At first, his ambition seemed admirable. But once the film premiered, Wiseau was launched into pop culture history for reasons he never anticipated. The performance he delivered became widely regarded as one of the least effective ever captured on screen. Behind the scenes, Wiseau's approach to filmmaking raised immediate concerns. Crew members later recalled that he struggled with line memorization, emotional continuity, and basic blocking. Scenes required numerous takes, not to refine artistry, but simply to achieve coherence. His acting style, marked by unpredictable vocal inflections, detached reactions, and abrupt emotional swings, left even seasoned professionals bewildered. Wiseau insisted on complete creative control, refusing to adjust his delivery even when the results were unintentionally comedic. Despite the challenges, the production pressed forward, creating an environment where everyone could sense something was off, yet no one knew the extent of the outcome until the premiere. When The Room finally reached audiences, the reaction was explosive. Instead of the tragic romance Wiseau envisioned, viewers encountered a performance so disconnected from human behavior that it became instantly iconic. Critics labeled it one of the worst acting displays ever put on film, citing the now famous rooftop scene and Wiseau's unusual cadence as evidence of an actor seemingly operating in his own cinematic universe. Lines meant to be emotional landed as punchlines. Moments intended to be intense felt strangely hollow. But paradoxically, this failure created a new kind of success. Hollywood's reaction was unlike anything seen before. Rather than fading into obscurity, Wiseau became the face of a phenomenon. A movie so bad it was adored. Midnight screenings, fan events, and decades of cult celebration turned The Room into an American cultural artifact. His performance, undeniably flawed, became central to the film's enduring appeal. Even respected filmmakers and actors found themselves fascinated by the sincerity behind the failure. When the disaster artist later brought the story to mainstream audiences, Wiseau's legacy solidified. He was a symbol of unfiltered ambition, colliding with the harsh realities of cinematic craft. In American pop culture, Tommy Wiseau stands as a reminder that even the worst acting can leave a lasting impact. His work is often ridiculed, yet it inspired documentaries, books, reenactments, and a cult following that continues to grow. His story reveals how Hollywood sometimes elevates the unconventional, turning shortcomings into legend. It is one of the strangest, most fascinating cases of failure transforming into immortality. 8. Cara Delevingne. Cara Delevingne's rise in American entertainment began not in film, but in fashion. As one of the most recognizable supermodels of the 2010s, she dominated runways, magazine covers, and global advertising campaigns. Her signature eyebrows, rebellious energy, and social media presence turned her into a cultural phenomenon long before Hollywood came calling. When studios saw her massive audience and magnetic public persona, they moved quickly to position her as a breakout movie star. At her peak, Delevingne was touted as the next major crossover talent, someone who could bring youth appeal and edgy charisma to big-budget films. But behind the glossy marketing, it became clear that the transition from modeling to acting would be far more challenging than expected. Industry insiders noted early signs of struggle, difficulty conveying emotional depth, inconsistent delivery, and a tendency to rely on attitude rather than character immersion. Directors observed that while Delevingne had strong instincts for style and expression, she lacked the technical groundwork that traditional film training provides. Her performances often felt surface level, as though she was still performing for a camera lens meant to capture still images rather than emotional arcs. Her biggest test came with Suicide Squad, a film heavily promoted on her presence. Despite the massive anticipation, her portrayal of the Enchantress drew widespread criticism. Reviewers described the performance as awkward, unfocused, and lacking the emotional grounding needed for a central villain. Visual effects dominated her screen time, but even in moments requiring subtlety, her delivery felt disconnected. Interviews from that period suggest Delevingne was aware of the scrutiny, often talking about the pressure of proving herself in a new industry while navigating intense media attention. Hollywood's reaction grew cautious. Follow-up roles in Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets and several indie projects generated similar responses. Visually striking presence, but noticeable difficulty anchoring complex narrative roles. The gap between her modeling persona and her on-screen characters became more visible with each project, and studios began scaling back expectations. As newer actresses with stronger acting foundations emerged, opportunities for Delevingne decreased, leaving her career in a limbo between celebrity status and serious film recognition. In American pop culture, Delevingne represents a broader Hollywood pattern, the belief that fame in one arena can effortlessly transfer to another. Her story highlights the challenges of moving from modeling a field built on presence and aesthetics to acting, which demands emotional vulnerability, vocal control, and character depth. Though Delevingne remains influential, especially in fashion and advocacy, her film legacy is defined by the contrast between enormous hype and performances that struggled to resonate. She stands as a reminder that charisma alone cannot overcome the craft required to thrive in Hollywood's most demanding roles. 7. Steven Seagal. Steven Seagal emerged in Hollywood as a completely new type of action star, a martial arts expert with authentic combat training and a calm, stoic presence that differentiated him from the explosive personalities dominating the genre. In the late 80s and early 90s, he became a major box office draw, headlining successful action thrillers that built him into an international name. His early films positioned him as a serious, quietly intense hero who relied on Aikido skill rather than theatrics. At his peak, Seagal enjoyed the full backing of studios, global visibility, and a devoted fan base that embraced his minimalist screen persona. But behind the scenes, signs of trouble were clear. Directors, stunt coordinators, and fellow performers often described difficulty working with him. Reports circulated about on-set conflicts, creative disagreements, and strained collaborations. Seagal's insistence on controlling narrative direction and emphasizing his own invincibility frequently clashed with the structure of ensemble filmmaking. As his reputation for being difficult grew, so did questions about his actual acting ability. Critics began noting that his performances were rigid, emotionally flat, and heavily dependent on action choreography rather than character development. As the action landscape evolved, Seagal's limitations became even more apparent. When the genre shifted toward more dynamic performances and layered protagonists, his style felt increasingly outdated. Attempts to diversify his roles revealed a narrow acting range that struggled with vulnerability, humor, or complexity. Reviewers regularly cited monotonous line delivery, lack of facial expression, and an apparent reluctance to portray characters with flaws. By the late 90s, the disconnect between Seagal's self-image and audience expectations grew unmistakable. Hollywood's response was swift. Big studios pulled back, and Seagal's work moved into the direct-to-video market, where he released a rapid stream of low-budget action films. Many of these projects were heavily edited to reduce his screen time, often relying on stand-ins and voice dubbing, a sign of how far his reputation had fallen. Even as he continued working steadily, the industry viewed him less as a leading man and more as a relic of an earlier era. Critics frequently ranked his later performances among the weakest in the genre, citing decreasing physical engagement and an almost detached presence on screen. In American pop culture, Steven Seagal has become a symbol of the action star whose persona overshadowed his craft. His legacy is marked by early commercial success, followed by a long decline into self-parody, memes, and online commentary about his increasingly unusual career choices. While some fans remain loyal, his acting reputation continues to suffer due to a combination of limited range, behind-the-scenes controversies, and an unwavering commitment to a screen persona that no longer resonates with modern audiences. His story illustrates how quickly Hollywood can shift and how unforgiving it is when a star refuses to evolve. 6. Madonna. Madonna revolutionized American pop music, fashion, and cultural expression, becoming one of the most influential entertainers of her generation. At her peak, she was a global phenomenon, a trendsetter who shaped conversations about identity, sexuality, and artistic freedom. With such extraordinary fame, Hollywood naturally saw an opportunity. Studios believed that her star power, charisma, and bold persona could translate seamlessly into film. Throughout the 80s and 90s, she was cast in a series of high-profile roles, marketed as a multi-talented performer who could dominate both music and movies. For a time, her visibility alone guaranteed attention and box office curiosity. But behind the promotional campaigns, industry insiders quickly realized the transition would not be smooth. Madonna approached acting with the same confidence that fueled her music career, yet directors noted she struggled to fully inhabit characters that required subtle emotional grounding. Her screen presence often felt self-conscious, as if she were performing an idea of a character rather than disappearing into one. Even when she worked with seasoned filmmakers, her delivery tended to be stiff or overly stylized, lacking the natural rhythm and vulnerability that narrative film demands. While she was fearless in challenging roles, fearlessness alone could not replace craft. Critics were sharp and consistent in their assessments. Performances in films like Shanghai Surprise, Body of Evidence, and Swept Away were widely panned, with reviewers citing forced emotional beats, awkward line delivery, and difficulty generating authentic chemistry with co-stars. Even in more favorable projects, commentary often focused on her limitations rather than her strengths. The industry began to question whether Madonna was better suited for music videos, a format built around controlled environments, stylization, and visual spectacle rather than traditional acting. Each new film created fresh debate, but the critical narrative rarely changed. Hollywood eventually reacted with caution. While Madonna continued to pursue acting, major studios became hesitant to center films around her. Casting directors shifted attention toward actresses with stronger training and more consistent screen performances. Audiences, too, developed expectations. Madonna in a movie meant intrigue, controversy, and heavy marketing, but not necessarily quality acting. Over time, she leaned more toward directing, touring, and building her music legacy, leaving her film career as a fascinating but uneven chapter. In American pop culture, Madonna's acting career is remembered as one of Hollywood's most high-profile mismatches between fame and ability. She remains an undisputed icon in music and style, but her cinematic legacy highlights the difference between stage presence and screen performance. Her journey reveals how even the most powerful celebrity persona can struggle in the face of Hollywood's unforgiving demands for emotional truth. Yet her willingness to take risks, even when the results were criticized, makes her story one of the most talked-about case studies in the intersection of fame, ambition, and artistic experimentation. 5. John Travolta. John Travolta's rise in American cinema was extraordinary. In the 70s, he became a cultural icon through Saturday Night Fever and Grease, cementing himself as one of Hollywood's most magnetic young stars. His charisma, dance talent, and effortless charm made him a household name, and for a time, he looked destined for a long, stable career at the top of the industry. But Travolta's trajectory would become one of Hollywood's strangest roller coasters, a mix of major comebacks, surprising misfires, and performances that drew critical attention for all the wrong reasons. Few actors have experienced highs and lows as dramatic as his. Behind the scenes, early co-workers described him as dedicated and eager to refine his craft, but as the years passed, some directors noted a growing tendency toward exaggerated choices that didn't always match the tone of a film. Travolta often gravitated toward characters requiring big emotions or theatrical flair, and when these instincts paired with strong directors, the results could be impressive. But when the material was weak or the direction uneven, those same instincts produced performances that felt over the top, inconsistent, or unintentionally humorous. As his roles expanded into thrillers, sci-fi projects, and experimental dramas, the mismatch between style and story became increasingly visible. The most notorious example of this came with Battlefield Earth, a film widely regarded as one of the most critically panned productions in Hollywood history. Travolta's performance was described as bombastic and unrestrained, filled with exaggerated facial expressions and dramatic turns that clashed with the film's already chaotic tone. While he envisioned the role as bold and transformative, critics saw a performance untethered from emotional grounding. The backlash was intense, reshaping public perception and triggering a long period of scrutiny toward his film choices. Hollywood's reaction was complicated. Travolta continued to work steadily, but the industry began to question whether he had become misaligned with modern acting expectations. His appearances in various thrillers and action films during the 2010s drew criticisms for lack of nuance, awkward delivery, and an almost theatrical stiffness. Reviewers noted that he sometimes seemed disconnected from the emotional stakes of a scene, slipping into melodrama even when the film required subtlety. This pattern led to a growing divide between his early legacy and his later output. In American pop culture, Travolta has become a symbol of a once great actor whose later career became unpredictable and uneven. His earlier accomplishments remain respected, and he is still beloved by many for his iconic roles and personal resilience. But his body of work also represents how an actor with immense talent can drift into a string of performances that place him on lists of Hollywood's most inconsistent and at times most criticized leading men. Travolta's story highlights the volatility of fame, the difficulty of reinvention, and the challenges of sustaining relevance in an industry that never stops evolving. 4. Adam Sandler. Adam Sandler became one of the most influential comedic voices of the 90s and early 2000s, rising from Saturday Night Live into a full-blown Hollywood powerhouse. His early films, light, chaotic, and irreverent, resonated with American audiences who loved his loud, childlike humor and everyman persona. At his peak, Sandler was a guaranteed box office success. Studios trusted him with major budgets, streaming platforms invested heavily in his brand, and he built an entire comedy empire that made him one of the highest-paid actors in the industry. Few performers have commanded such sustained commercial power across decades. But behind the numbers, critics and filmmakers pointed to a recurring issue. Sandler's comfort with easy formulas often overshadowed his potential as an actor. While he proved capable of nuanced performances in films like Punch Drunk Love and Uncut Gems, the majority of his mainstream output relied on broad humor, repetitive character types, and improvisational scenes that lacked emotional structure. Directors who worked with him described a performer who excelled in his own comedic lane but rarely reached beyond it. This created a widening gap between his enormous popularity and his reputation among critics. Public reaction reflected that divide. Many of Sandler's comedy films were financial hits, but faced relentless negative reviews, often citing lazy writing, shallow character work, and moments that felt more like inside jokes among friends than crafted cinematic performances. His reliance on exaggerated personas, the angry man-child, the socially awkward hero, the lovable slacker, drew criticism for being one-note and lacking the range expected of a leading actor in major studio films. Even fans who enjoyed his early work began expressing frustration as the formula became predictable. Hollywood's response evolved over time. While studios continued to support his projects due to their impressive financial returns, there was a growing perception that Sandler was intentionally avoiding challenging roles. This was reinforced by his own interviews, where he joked about making low-effort comedies simply because the process was fun. When streaming platforms entered the picture, Sandler's output increased dramatically, but so did the skepticism. Many of these films were criticized for weak performances, awkward comedic timing, and an overall sense that he was coasting rather than pushing himself creatively. In American pop culture, Sandler represents a unique contradiction, a beloved entertainer with remarkable staying power and genuine acting ability, yet also one of the most frequently cited names in discussions about Hollywood's weakest performances. His career raises questions about what audiences value: consistency, comfort, and personality, or craft, evolution, and emotional depth. Sandler remains a major force in entertainment, but his legacy in film is undeniably shaped by a long list of roles that leaned heavily on habit rather than artistry. 3. Kristen Stewart. Kristen Stewart's rise in Hollywood was meteoric. Practically overnight, she became one of the most recognizable actresses of her generation after taking on the role of Bella Swan in the Twilight franchise, a cultural juggernaut that dominated American entertainment throughout the late 2000s. At her peak, she was everywhere: red carpets, magazine covers, late-night shows, and global press tours. The franchise made her a household name and positioned her as a defining figure of young Hollywood. Studios believed she had the potential to transition from teen idol to serious leading actress, backed by one of the most dedicated fan bases in the world. But behind the worldwide success, Stewart's acting style quickly became one of the most polarizing topics in modern film. Directors noticed early signs of tension between her naturalistic internal approach and the heightened emotional demands of blockbuster storytelling. Her performances often appeared muted, withdrawn, and restrained, with repetitive expressions and a tendency to rely on limited gestures, the biting of the lip, the downward gaze, the hesitant delivery. While this style worked in certain indie films, it clashed sharply with the melodramatic tone of Twilight. Critics were blunt, repeatedly calling out her lack of emotional variation and her inability to connect with the heightened romance at the story's core. Public reaction mirrored this divide. Fans of the franchise embraced her as the face of a beloved series, but a huge portion of audiences, especially in the United States, criticized her acting as wooden or disengaged. Parodies, memes, and commentary shows fixated on her perceived lack of facial expression, turning her into an easy target during peak internet culture. Even when she took on more ambitious roles, the shadow of Twilight followed her. Major studio attempts to reposition her as an action star, such as in Snow White and the Huntsman, faced mixed results, with reviewers again citing stiffness and difficulty carrying emotional arcs. Hollywood's response was gradual but telling. Stewart began receiving fewer mainstream offers and shifted increasingly toward independent cinema, where her minimalist style was better appreciated. While she later earned critical praise for certain indie performances, many industry observers agreed that she struggled whenever placed at the center of big-budget productions requiring dynamic emotional presence. The contrast between massive fame and a career marked by inconsistent performances made her one of the most debated actresses of her era. In American pop culture, Kristen Stewart represents the tension between celebrity and craft. She remains respected for her willingness to take creative risks and rebuild her career outside the Hollywood system. Yet her legacy is deeply tied to a period when her acting style became symbolic of franchise miscasting. Her story highlights how quickly the spotlight can magnify an actor's weaknesses and how hard it is to reshape public perception once criticism becomes part of a cultural narrative. 2. Mark Wahlberg. Mark Wahlberg's rise in American entertainment is one of the most unlikely transformations in modern Hollywood. He began as a controversial figure in the music world, then shifted into modeling, and eventually broke into acting with surprising speed. By the late 90s and early 2000s, Wahlberg became a bankable Hollywood presence, especially after acclaimed performances in films like Boogie Nights and The Departed. His tough, grounded persona resonated with audiences, and studios increasingly positioned him as a reliable leading man in action films, comedies, and dramas. At his peak, Wahlberg was a marquee name whose projects guaranteed attention and box office pull. But behind the commercial success, industry insiders and critics noted a recurring pattern. Wahlberg often struggled with emotional nuance, vocal modulation, and the ability to elevate weak material. Directors described him as disciplined and professional, yet limited in range. He thrived in roles aligned with his natural energy, tough, anxious, or streetwise characters, but faltered when a film required subtle introspection or deep emotional shifts. His performances frequently leaned on a narrow set of expressions: confusion, irritation, or rapid-fire intensity. This repetition became noticeable across genres, from thrillers to comedies. Critical reaction sharpened over time. Films like The Happening, Max Payne, and Transformers: Age of Extinction drew widespread criticism for flat delivery, awkward emotional beats, and moments that critics described as unintentionally comedic. His line delivery sometimes felt rushed or ungrounded, as though he were reacting to the rhythm of the script rather than the internal logic of the character. Even in higher-budget projects, reviewers increasingly cited Wahlberg as a weak link, a performer whose star power carried him further than his acting ability. Hollywood's response was complex but strategic. Wahlberg remained valuable because he was reliable, physically committed, and capable of anchoring large commercial projects. Yet directors looking for depth or vulnerability often looked elsewhere. As his career progressed, he leaned heavily into action-comedy hybrids and franchise-style roles that relied more on energy and charm than on dramatic transformation. Interviews from this period reflect a pragmatic performer, aware of his strengths and content to stay within them, rather than attempting radical reinvention. In American pop culture, Mark Wahlberg occupies a unique space. He is undeniably successful, with decades of major roles and a strong producing career, yet he is frequently mentioned in discussions about Hollywood's most inconsistent actors. His story reveals the divide between commercial viability and artistic reputation, a reminder that box office power does not always equate to performance depth. Wahlberg's career highlights how charisma, physicality, and a strong personal brand can propel a performer far, even when critics continually question the craft behind the fame. 1. Bruce Willis. Bruce Willis became one of the most defining faces of American action cinema. His rise from television comedy to global stardom was meteoric, fueled by the enormous success of Die Hard, a film that redefined the genre and established him as a new kind of hero, relatable, flawed, and effortlessly charismatic. Throughout the late 80s and 90s, Willis became a box office powerhouse with a combination of charm, sarcasm, and understated toughness. He was positioned not just as an action icon, but as a versatile leading man capable of balancing blockbusters with dramatic roles like The Sixth Sense and Pulp Fiction. At his peak, he was one of Hollywood's most influential stars. But behind the fame, the seeds of later criticism began forming. Willis's trademark performance style, cool detachment, quiet intensity, and minimalist delivery worked brilliantly in certain roles, but struggled in others. As he moved deeper into the 2000s and 2010s, directors and co-stars noted an increasing sense of disengagement on set. His line readings became flatter, his emotional range narrower, and his physical presence more subdued. Industry insiders observed that he sometimes relied on the persona he had built rather than immersing himself in character, creating performances that felt hollow or unfinished. Critics picked up on the shift. Roles in low-budget action films, rushed thrillers, and direct-to-streaming projects drew sharp commentary for lack of energy and effort. The disconnect between Willis's legendary past and his present output became a recurring subject in American entertainment media. Some speculated burnout, others blamed miscasting or weak scripts. But as the pattern persisted, audiences grew increasingly frustrated. Reviews described his acting as monotone, unmotivated, or emotionally absent, far from the dynamic presence that once defined him. Hollywood's reaction took time, but eventually reached a breaking point. As more low-effort performances accumulated, casting directors gradually moved away from the belief that Willis could carry major films. He continued appearing in numerous small productions, but these roles only intensified public criticism, with many questioning why a former megastar seemed so unable or unwilling to recapture his earlier spark. It wasn't until much later that the public learned the deeper truth behind this decline. In American pop culture, Willis's legacy is extraordinarily complex. He is simultaneously celebrated as one of cinema's great action icons and criticized for a long stretch of performances viewed as among the weakest of any major Hollywood star. His later work, once a mystery, is now better understood, but the impact of that period remains part of his story. Willis stands as an example of how a brilliant early career can be overshadowed by years of diminished performances, and how the camera, over time, reveals everything: the highs, the lows, and the human vulnerability behind even the strongest screen heroes. In Hollywood, reputations rise and collapse under the weight of the camera's truth. Some actors soar, others fade, and a few become lasting examples of how fame can outgrow ability. The stories in this countdown reveal the fragile balance between talent, expectation, and the relentless scrutiny of American audiences. If you want to explore more breakdowns like this one, our previous episodes are linked in the description and pinned in the comments. For now, this is Fallen Icons. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the shadowed corners of Hollywood.